Hi everyone, Miss Portelli here. So the purpose of today's set of notes is to get you guys all up to speed on the difference between a structural, physiological and behavioral adaptation that occur in different organisms throughout our planet. Hopefully by this stage you have completed your holiday homework and have a pretty basic understanding of the difference there. If not, hopefully I'm able to help you out. Let's start with a bit of background information. Some of you may already be aware of this. If not, some fun facts for you. So for humans to survive out in the world, we usually follow the rule of three. So the rule of three refers to our requirements for things like oxygen, food, water, and shelter. So if you're looking at the slide here, you'll see that for a human to be able to survive, we can't really survive any longer than 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 hours if we're exposed to a harsh environment such as a desert or somewhere really cold like Antarctica. Can't survive any longer than 3 days without water, and then 3 weeks without food. Why am I mentioning this? Because every organism on our planet also has their own unique requirements. It may be slightly different to what we as humans need, but if they can't meet those requirements, then that's when we're going to see negative impacts on their health and potentially that organism dying. Adaptations, whether they be structural, physiological, or behavioral, are designed to increase the chance of that organism's survival if they're ever to encounter those things that could potentially kill them. So as I said before, an adaptation is a feature that an organism has that is there. Its sole purpose is to help with that organism's survival in particular environmental conditions. Not all organisms will have adaptations to survive in all environments. I guess the amazing thing about adaptations is that they are unique to the environment that that particular organism is used to surviving in. So for example, if a species of organism is native to a desert environment, their adaptations are going to be unique and specific to a desert environment. Those same adaptations or those same features in that organism will not necessarily suit them if they were living in a more aquatic environment or even a cooler temperature environment. Okay, so a couple of new terms that we need to start using in this unit. The first one being tolerance range. So our tolerance range is referring to the varied conditions that an organism can survive in. I think probably the easiest way to explain this to you guys is to have a look at that diagram that's on the screen in front of you with the fish. So you'll see that along the bottom here, we have a scale of temperature going from low temperature to high temperature. Now, if you look at the diagram, you would say that the majority of the fish are surviving in that middle zone, okay? That middle zone is where the ideal temperature for these fish to survive is. That temperature allows them to perform their daily functions easily. It is ideal for them to be able to find a mate and reproduce successfully, continuing that population on. You'll then notice that if we go a little bit lower in temperature or a little bit higher in temperature, we don't see as many fish in these zones. So there's about 3 fish in each zone. Okay, that's representing as we move outside the ideal conditions for these fish, we're going to start seeing the environment putting stresses on the body of the fish. And some of those basic functions that a fish would perform may not happen as effectively or could potentially not happen at all. So for example, if it is extremely hot, so in this zone here, you might find that the fish is working overtime to try and keep itself nice and cool and regulate its body temperature. It's expending too much energy in doing that. So other processes within the fish are suffering. it might mean that it doesn't have the energy to expend on things like reproduction. It's more focused on keeping itself alive rather than reproducing and creating the next generation. We then move into the grey zone at either end, where you can see absolutely no fish. Okay, so that is classified as the zone of intolerance, and it is where we have reached a point where the fish actually cannot survive. So you would not expect to see any fish surviving or reproducing in those zones because the conditions are too extreme. So that's the example of the fish there. Obviously our tolerance range, our middle zone where we're seeing fish survive, our optimal zone is here in the middle. Okay, where the majority of fish are going to survive and they're going to survive well. And then we have these smaller areas to the side here. Okay, but as long as fish are surviving and they are still able to reproduce, it's still classified in their tolerance range. Anything outside of that tolerance range, and we're going to see fish dying. Or if we were looking at a different example, it could be any organism dying. In saying that, it could also be a number of factors that are limiting the survival of that organism. So the example in that diagram we've just looked at is temperature, but it could also be things like oxygen concentration, light intensity, especially if we were looking at, say, a plant. The access to light is definitely going to affect how large its tolerance range is, and also UV exposure. So think about, or humans would be a great example of that. If we're exposed to direct sunlight, strong, intense sunlight, that can definitely have negative consequences for us. So those sorts of external factors that the organism is experiencing, we refer to them as limiting factors because it is usually one of those things, or sometimes multiple, that will limit that organism's ability to survive outside its tolerance range. Okay, we're getting right down to the crux of it now. So we've just discussed tolerance range being the environmental conditions that an organism is able to survive and reproduce in. And that tolerance range is influenced by the types of adaptations an organism has to it. So an organism can have many different adaptations to help it survive within its tolerance range, and we classify those adaptations into 3 different categories, so behavioural, structural and physiological. So the key difference between the 3 here, a behavioural adaptation is always an adaptation where the organism is choosing to do it. It is their behaviour, it is their choice, and we'll look at some examples in a moment. A structural adaptation is a physical feature of that organism that never changes. Okay, so that physical feature of an organism, obviously once it has reached adulthood or its mature age, and that physical feature does not change. Again, we'll look at some more specific examples of structural adaptations in a moment. And our physiological one, or physiological adaptations, this is probably the one that students most struggle with identifying. I always think it's a really good idea to think of a physiological adaptation is something that's happening inside your body that you have absolutely no control of. Okay, so a great example of things that are happening inside our bodies that we have absolutely no control of are things like producing hormones, replenishing our red and white blood cells that circulate through our circulatory system. Okay, we have absolutely no control over when or how that happens, but it is something that is happening in our bodies as we speak. Behavioural adaptations. Pretty straightforward. I don't think you guys are going to need too much help with this. Remember, it is a choice. Is the organism choosing to do this action? So everything on that list there, the organism is choosing to do that. It may be a learned behaviour, but it is still a choice. So things like putting on a jumper when you get cold, like the kangaroo in the image here. When it's really, really hot, they seek shade. Or I'm sure some of you might be able to relate to the image here with the dog lying belly down on the cold tiles. Probably going to do that if it's a hot day. That's a behavior that the dog has chosen to perform. The sheep here in this image, they have chosen to live in a herd, okay? By living in a herd, they're increasing their chance of survival by protecting each other from a predator. Other examples would be things like mating displays or courtship displays. Lots of birds choose to create elaborate nests, or they have, some sort of dance display that they perform in front of their mate to try and attract them. Okay, they are all examples of behavioral adaptations because they are choices. Structural adaptations. So these are the physical characteristics of the organism that they cannot change. Okay, so once they reach adulthood, they are stuck like that. Some really obvious examples would be, does the organism have fur, feathers? Maybe it has scales, teeth, the size of their muscles. Do they have opposable thumbs and fingers like we do, or do they have paws? Do they have wings? Okay, so they're all physical structures that exist within an organism or on an organism that could potentially help them with survival. Okay, some examples of how they could help them with survival. Well, here's a really obvious one. Wings. Probably going to be an advantage to have them because you might be able to fly away from predators. Having fur. If you live in a cooler climate, having fur acts as that extra layer of insulation to keep you warm. Or you might flip it and go, you know what? The fur actually does nothing to help with my body temperature control, but it's great as a camouflage tool when I'm trying to sneak up and hunt prey. And finally, we have our physiological adaptations. So just a reminder that our physiological adaptations are processes that are happening within your body. You do not need to think about it. You have absolutely no control over, and they will happen automatically. Some really obvious ones that you will be familiar with is obviously if we get really, really hot, our bodies tend to sweat. We can't control sweating. It just naturally happens. It's our body's natural physiological adaptation that has developed to allow us to keep our body temperature within that narrow tolerance range. Same with shivering. If we get too cold, we're going to start to shiver to try and generate heat to keep our bodies within that narrow tolerance range. So each one of these dot points is showing you some form of internal feature that is triggered that should help that organism maintain its internal environment within that narrow tolerance range. Some other ones that people might not necessarily link straight away with physiological adaptations is this one, which I think is really cool. Making venom. Okay, so spiders and snakes, organisms like that, their bodies naturally make venom. They have no control over this, they just do it. But that is an adaptation because it is actually allowing these organisms to have easier access or an enhanced ability to capture and kill their prey so that they can access their food source. Okay, so there's lots of different things that fall into this category. Another little trick that you might want to use, because this is probably the hardest category to identify, if you come across an adaptation and you know it's not a behavioral adaptation and you know that it's not a structural adaptation, it's probably going to be a physiological adaptation. So just rule out the other two first and you'll be left with this.